Welcome to Introduction to Game Development. My name is Dr. Lee Phelan, and I will be your instructor this term. So, in this course, we will be talking about not just how to design and develop games, but how to analyze and evaluate the design and development of other games. This is an important framework skill set to develop because it allows us to have conversations about what makes a game interesting or effective or engaging using a common set of vocabulary. And over the years, different groups of people have developed different ways to analyze games, and we're going to talk about a few of them in this course. But to start out, we need to ask this fundamental question: what actually is a game? And like game analysis, lots of different people have come up with their own definitions of how to do this. Bernard Suits has a pretty famous definition. Playing a game is the voluntary attempt to overcome unnecessary obstacles. So, voluntary attempt is a key part of this. He also goes on to say there are four defining traits of a game: goals, rules, feedback system, and the voluntary participation. So, as an example, here is a famous game, Super Mario Brothers. The goal is to progress through the levels to rescue the princess. The rules are relatively simple. Use the control pad to move, A button jumps, B runs and shoots fireballs. You jump on most things to kill them, but if you touch them in other ways, you will die. And there are several feedback systems in place: coins, points, timers, sound effects, visualizations, etc. And of course, playing Super Mario Brothers is a voluntary experience. Perhaps a less obvious game is Duolingo. The goal is to learn a new language. It's a voluntary experience. The rules are to identify the correct translation in a variety of scenarios. And the feedback system includes sounds, animations, hearts, streaks, trophies, and XP. So games can come in many different forms, especially if we broaden our definition enough. Now, one thing about the goals is it's not necessary that a game disclose its goals up front. For example, the game Portal doesn't really tell you what's going on until several levels into the game. It kind of unfolds as a mystery. All you really need to know for the goal is the next step. And in the opening scene, you have the next step. You need to stand on this thing, and you see that it will open the door, and you can tell by the sign that you go through this door, but you don't really know what's going on. Why are you in this room? What's on the other side of the door? None of that is revealed to you. So you have these subsidiary goals, and you know how to accomplish those things. And there's a little indicator on the platform saying, put the box here. So again, you don't necessarily need to know everything about the game for it to be a game. Now, Sid Meier, a relatively famous game designer from the Civilization series, amongst others, says a game is a series of interesting choices. The definition that Sid uses includes the fact that these choices, there have to be multiple valid options, different things you can choose. So, for example, in the Civilization games, you can choose to, on any given turn, to build, attack, move, repair, guard, etc. Lots of different choices, but you have a limited number of choices you can make each turn. So you have multiple options, all of them valid, and you have to decide what to do. Each option, according to this definition, has to have both positive and negative consequences. So in Civilization, there is obviously the opportunity cost. If you choose to move, you can't attack, and vice versa. You also have potential negative consequences of your other opponent. So if you choose to interact with a neighbor in a certain way, a neighboring civilization, it will affect your standing with them, and they may choose to attack you. Many actions require the use of resources, but many actions also help you to acquire new resources or land. So all of these consequences come into play. And finally, the actions, the outcomes have to be predictable, but not guaranteed. So, in other words, you know what the actions do and you're informed of the most likely outcome, but you don't know for sure 100% certainty if an attack will succeed or what the actual cost will be, just the most likely cost. When you start building, you commit a resource for a certain number of turns and you expect that that will go to completion, but you don't know. You may be attacked while you're in the middle of that and have to interrupt it or lose those resources. So, predictable but not guaranteed outcomes. Now, the book goes into lots of other definitions. One other one that I like, Jeremy Bond, who is the author of the book, says an interactive experience, in other words, a game, is any experience created by a designer inscribed into rules, media, or technology, and decoded by people through play. And again, the book goes through lots of other definitions of what is a game by famous game designers. None of these are the one true definition to rule them all, but it's important that if you're talking with other people, if you're working in a game design studio or interacting with other folks, that you have a fairly good working definition that you agree upon about what a game is and is not. Now, speaking of that shared definition, Jeremy Bond points out that definitions help you understand what people expect from your games. So, this is especially important if you're working in a specific genre. If you say this game is a tower defense game, you better understand what people expect from tower defense, not just what you expect, but what do your players expect. Otherwise, they go into a game and they have a certain expectation. And if your game doesn't meet those expectations, even if it's an awesome game, they will be disappointed and give you negative reviews or negative feedback. So if you have that shared definition, though, and you understand what are the tropes of a tower defense game, how does a first person shooter work? What do people like about puzzle games? What do people like about hidden object games? Then you can go into those situations and understand what you need to make sure, which rules you can follow, which rules you can break, what you can do differently, and still have a successful game experience. Now, I mentioned at the beginning that we want to have frameworks for analyzing games. This is important so you can look at an existing game. For example, we can look at Plants vs. Zombies and say, what is interesting about Plants vs. Zombies? Why is it engaging? Why is it successful? And we can have a shared set of definitions to talk about that. However, as much as we like shared definitions, everyone has their kind of pet way of analyzing games, and there have been several game analysis frameworks discussed and created over the years. One of the most famous ones is the MDA framework. The MDA framework seeks to break down a game into three different elements: the mechanics, the dynamics, and the aesthetics. So, according to MDA, the mechanics of a game are the components of the game at the level of data representation and algorithm. In other words, how does the code of the game control what happens? Those are the mechanics of the game. The dynamics of the game is the runtime behavior of the mechanics acting on the player input. So, for example, if in Super Mario Brothers, the mechanics might represent how often do Goombas appear, how often does the piranha plant come out of the pipe. The dynamics are when Mario jumps, what happens at that point? How does the arc of the jump progress across the screen? What happens when he lands on a certain character? The aesthetics are the emotional responses invoked in the player when they interact with the game system. So, how does the game look? How does it feel? How does it sound? How does it interact with your senses? Now, one thing that the book says that I don't necessarily agree with is that game designers and game players approach the game analysis from different directions. The book says that game designers often start with the aesthetic of the game. How do they want the game to look? How do they want it to feel? What emotions do they want it to evoke? And then they figure out, okay, how should the game work from the player's point of view? We would call that the dynamics. And then what are the mechanics we need behind the scenes to make all that happen? I do agree with that. I don't agree with the idea that the players approach games from the opposite direction, that they're interested in the mechanics and the dynamics and the aesthetics. Most players I know are actually following the same direction as the designers. They look at the aesthetic of the game, or they are interested in a particular genre of game. Hey, I love hidden object games, or I love tower defense games, and they approach it that way. Not as interested in the MDA definition of mechanics as they are the aesthetics and dynamics. Another game analysis framework that's relatively famous is the formal dramatic dynamic analysis framework. So this breaks down the game into three different elements. Formal elements are what makes the game different from other forms of media or interaction and provide the structure of the game. So the rules, resource acquisition, boundaries, things like that. Like what makes it a certain type of game. So a tower defense game, to go back to that example, has very specific structures that you follow, whether it's TD balloons or Plants vs. Zombies. You have stationary things that you put into place that are attacking an oncoming opponent. That is a structure of a tower defense game, a formal element. We also have dramatic elements. That's the story and narrative of the game. Even though TD Balloons and Plants vs. Zombies are both tower defense games, they have very different stories and narratives. And so the narrative is typically what you use to teach the rules and the purpose of the game. And so it also is what is the engaging part of the game. People become emotionally invested in games with good dramatic elements. They might become interested from a personal challenge point of view from a game with difficult formal and dynamic elements, but it is the narrative and the dramatic element that keeps the game interesting over the long term. And then finally, we have the dynamic elements. And again, this is the what happens during gameplay. So once the players start playing the game, it's the dynamic elements that kind of control, along with the dramatic elements, their experience. Dynamic elements include strategy, the behavior of the AI, relationships between game entities, etc. So in a game like Civilization, your formal elements are you've got this hex map where you can put down resources, create civilizations, put cities, move characters, move your armies and workers, etc. The dramatic elements are you are a civilization leader interacting with other civilizations, and you have rules about what happens when you interact in certain ways and what your character can do within the context of that game. And then dynamically, we have what happens if you move a character. What happens if a one of your armies goes adjacent to another army? What happens if you attempt to capture a city? What is the best approach for gathering resources, etc.? And then finally, there is what is known as the elemental tetrad. This one's less popular, but it says that the aesthetics, mechanics, story, and technology are the four components of any game. It uses mechanics differently and this definition. So, in this definition, mechanics is what most of the other definitions refer to as dynamics. And then the technology is what's happening behind the scenes. But the aesthetics and story are the same basic definitions as the others. So, just like with the definition of a game, there is no one true analysis framework that's better than all the others. In fact, the book will present another one next week that tries to synthesize elements from all of the ones presented so far. And that's often what happens with game design books. They try to present their own analysis framework. So, MDA is probably the most popular. 611, which is one you'll learn about if you take Essentials of Gamification, is another very popular game analysis framework that seeks to describe games in terms of their emotional impact on players. But the book is going to present another one, so just be watchful for that. All right, so the book goes into more detail about these things and also presents a couple of other game definitions. So make sure you pay careful attention to chapters 1 and 2. And if you have any questions, be sure to reach out on Slack or via email.